My name is Georgetta Dragoyu, and I'm an FCO in Region 1, and I'm here today with Bob Glasson, who we actually call Beach Bob because he's FEMA's very own beach and dune specialist. So Bob, it's a beautiful day out today. I'm wondering if you could just give us a little bit about your background and your role at FEMA.
Okay, well, I started with FEMA as a local hire, and I started doing gravel roads and bridges. But it turns out that I went to graduate school to become a marine geologist. And the kind of marine geologist I am is a coastal geomorphologist, which means I'm a beach geologist. And so I really enjoyed working on beaches, teaching people about beaches, teaching applicants about beaches, and doing beaches on beach projects on all of our coasts for FEMA.
Bob, thank you so much for your good work. I'm wondering if you can help us understand why beaches are important and why FEMA cares so much about beach restoration.
FEMA does beaches for two big reasons. The first is that they provide protection to the infrastructure behind them from coastal storms. They are a good wave buffer. The second reason FEMA does beaches is to restore the economic base of these coastal communities that depend on tourism.
Great, so I'm hearing storm protection, economic activity like tourism. Let's just jump into beach eligibility. What would a beach need to qualify for FEMA funding under our public assistance program?
To qualify for public assistance, the beach has to be an engineered facility. And what does that mean? It means that it's constructed to a designed elevation, width, and slope. And it's maintained to preserve that design by the addition of sand.
So when I think about maintenance, I think about trash pickup and raking seaweed. Seems like you're referring to other maintenance activities.
Exactly. FEMA doesn't consider the trash pickup contract or the raking seaweed to be maintenance. FEMA wants to see beach renourishment, and that means the addition of sand on a periodic basis to maintain the design. That's what we want to see in terms of FEMA maintenance.
Now, I'm going to ask a question that we heard a lot from our applicants when we've been out in the field. What is the responsibility of FEMA vis-a-vis another federal agency like the U.S. Corps of Engineers?
Okay. It's a great question because we get it all the time. It's important to understand that the Corps of Engineers builds beaches, FEMA repairs beaches. So once the Corps of Engineers has constructed a project, and they construct engineered beaches, but once the Corps of Engineers has constructed a project, FEMA does not add sand to that project after a storm because it's the responsibility of another federal agency.
Thank you so much for clarifying that. I did also want to get some clarity on what you mean by an engineered beach, what criteria you look for when assessing whether a beach is engineered.
Okay. Well, the first thing is the beach has to be constructed to a designed elevation, width, and slope, and it has to be maintained by the addition of sand to preserve the design. So, good question is, how does an applicant demonstrate that to us? What we want to see is we want to see design drawings and as-builts that show it was constructed to a designed elevation, width, and slope, and that it's been maintained through the years. And by maintenance, as we discussed, it's the addition of sand to preserve the design.
So Bob, in the scenario where we have an engineered beach, can you help us understand what damages after a storm might be to an engineered beach?
Sure. The first thing we're interested in is replacing the sand loss. We also replace dune planting and sand fence, but let's talk about replacing sand loss. All right? How do we do that? How do we know how much sand loss there was? We can't just go out to a beach and look at the dry beach and measure, because a beach is dynamic. It moves back and forth with the seasons. And how do we address that situation? Well, because the FEMA beach includes not only the sand dune, but it includes the beach across the dry beach, all the way out into the water, to the seaward limit of what we call the active nearshore zone. And where's the seaward limit of the active nearshore zone? We call that depth of closure. And depth of closure is the point where the waves that are coming in from offshore start to move sand.
So Bob, you just explained that the FEMA beach extends offshore. So how does FEMA determine sand loss then?
What FEMA does is they take the pre-storm surveys that are done by the applicant, which are surveys of not only the dry beach, but they go offshore, underwater, so we call them bathymetric surveys. They go underwater all the way out to this depth of closure. And that may be 30, 35 feet deep on the Atlantic coast. And that may be 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 feet offshore. So the FEMA beach may be 20% dry beach and 80% wet beach. And we take these surveys, the bathymetric surveys that are done by the applicants before hurricane season, and compare them to the surveys the applicant does after they're hit by a storm. We compare the pre-storm and post-storm surveys and determine how much sand change there was, how much sand has been lost.
Great. Well, thanks so much for explaining that. I'm wondering if you might have a good analogy for us to understand, again, what the FEMA beach means and this concept of the depth of closure.
I've found the easiest way to explain it to people is to consider it to be a big sandbox. So the beach, the length of the sandbox is the beach goes from one end of the beach to the other. So that's the length of the sandbox. The width of the sandbox goes from the sand dune all the way out into the water to the depth of closure. As long as the sand is still in the sandbox, it hasn't been lost as far as FEMA is concerned. It can be shifted from one end of the box to the other, but the important thing is it's not sand loss until it gets washed out of the sandbox. Once it gets washed out of the sandbox, we have sand loss, and that's what we replace, is the sand loss caused by the storm.
Great. Thank you so much for that clarification. We're going to shift gears a little bit now that I think we received a good summary of engineered beaches and eligibility. What about natural beaches? Are there any FEMA programs for natural beaches?
Yes, we have what's called the Category B Emergency Berm Program. And that program is designed for the situation when a storm comes and wipes out the sand dunes and the property behind it is vulnerable to flooding from future storms. So what we do is we make an analysis to determine what flooding on that beach looks like.
So Bob, after a storm, how do we determine if an applicant is eligible for one of these emergency berms?
Okay, what we look at is we want to determine whether or not the improved property, which can be any property, public or private, and it can be buildings, it can be infrastructure, it can be roads, it can be anything, if that property is susceptible to being damaged by flooding from what's called a 5-year storm.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a simple question that might not necessarily have a simple answer in this context, but can you just please define what flooding means in this context?
Okay, so what is flooding on a beach from a 5-year storm? Okay, it has two components really. It has the storm surge and it has the wave run-up that will be associated with a 5-year storm. So we calculate using the 5-year wave parameters, wave height, wave period, the slope of the beach, and calculate how much water level we would get from a 5-year storm on the beach. If that exceeds the post-storm profile, then we say they're eligible for placement of an emergency berm.
So Bob, I want to just touch briefly on mitigation and EHP. Just to clarify, EHP stands for Environmental and Historic Preservation at FEMA, and we have dedicated teams at FEMA who just work on mitigation and EHP, but I want to just touch on any mitigation opportunities for engineered or natural beaches.
Well, first of all, we can't do mitigation on emergency work projects. So our Category B emergency berm projects are not eligible for mitigation. But the Category G engineered beach projects are. And the kind of things we typically do are add dune plants to the dunes like you see here, or we often add sand fence like we see here that helps build the dune.
So Bob, what about some EHP considerations?
Well, the thing we have to remember to start with is that the federal project has to be in compliance with all local, state, federal environmental laws and executive orders. That means basically is the project has to have the proper environmental permits. We also have to be careful to avoid threatened and endangered species that use the beach. For example, in Florida, a lot of those beaches are very important for sea turtle nesting. So we schedule the projects to avoid the sea turtles, and in areas where we can, we take extra measures, or the applicant takes extra measures to avoid turtles. And the other kind of thing is sometimes there's piping plovers which nest on the beach, so we avoid those. So those are two examples. The other thing, quickly I'll mention, is that some of these beaches have COBRA zones, which Coastal Barrier and Resource Act system units within them. And if that's the case, our EHP people have to have a consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service to see whether or not they'll allow a beach nourishment project within the COBRA zone.
Beach Bob, thank you so much for walking us through beach and dune eligibility for FEMA's Public Assistance Program. We're so grateful for your expertise and your service to the American people. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's been fun. Thank you.